So welcome everyone. We're joined today by Andrew McLuhan, who is the founder and director of the McLuhan Institute. He's also the grandson of Marshall McLuhan and the son of Eric McLuhan. And with the McLuhan Institute, he's working to promote and preserve the work of his father and grandfather. And he did a talk, I think it was last month, maybe the month before, in which I heard him speak about the practical applications of his work rather than just the theoretical applications of it. And I thought that was super interesting, so I reached out to him and asked if he wanted to come and do a talk during RCA 2020, and luckily he said yes, so he is here today and he will be speaking about that. So I'm going to hand over the mic to him. I mute myself. After you, Andrew.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Julia, and the Royal College of Art in London. It's a pleasure to be here and there. Yeah, I have a policy of saying yes to things if possible. Even the most random things, because they're all opportunities for growth and exploration. And anytime I'm asked to teach something, I jump at it because I learn most when I'm teaching, if that makes any sense. So my talk today is based on the title Julie gave it, The Practice of Media Ecology Applied in McLuhan in 2020. I'm going to read a few different things as we go along, but before I begin, I'll start with some words from Marshall, which I felt were apt. Time is not the same for the speaker as for the audience. To the speaker, it is too brief for what he has to say. For the audience, it is grim foretaste of eternity. I certainly feel the first is true in my case. I've got a lot to cover. Hopefully, it's not a grim foretaste of eternity, but we all have a good time. Part of the way I'm hoping to accomplish that is by not having prepared a written speech beforehand, but using my grandfather and father's method of thinking about a topic and making notes and then speaking off notes. And that's a really great way to engage with an audience. I'm not sure how it's going to work engaging the digital audience, but there you have it. I guess I'll have to engage with myself. Julia already mentioned a little bit about myself, but to give you some context of where I'm coming from, Marshall is my grandfather. Eric McLuhan was my father. Eric studied and worked very closely with Marshall from the mid-late 1960s up until Marshall's death, New Year's Eve 1980. And I worked with my father from about the last 10 years of his life. Eric died in 2018. But the way I worked with my father and the way my father worked with his father were very different. My dad went to university, got his bachelor's, master's, PhD, English literature. He went the academic route, very much following his father's footsteps. And indeed, he was raised that way to be kind of the next Marshall McLuhan. I barely graduated high school because my interests lay elsewhere, and was never really interested in pursuing academic work. I do kind of wish I'd gone to university more recently just to be able to survey a lot of philosophy and especially English literature. And maybe I'll get to that someday. But as Julia mentioned, my interest in McLuhan work, and maybe it's because I'm from outside academia, is in the practical applications of it. What can we use from it to help us today, and especially to help us toward a better tomorrow, whatever that may mean. A few years ago, 3 years ago actually, I started this thing called the McLuhan Institute. And I started it essentially because nobody else had. I was at a point in my life where I was about to turn 40, and I felt if I was going to do something more with McLuhan work than just working part-time with my dad, now was the time to make a go of it. So I came up with this idea for McLuhan Institute as a place to continue McLuhan studies in the McLuhan tradition. And I'll talk a little bit about what McLuhan studies in the McLuhan tradition means today. So to get into that a little bit, Marshall McLuhan was also extremely interested in the practical. He said things like, I have no theories, I'm not a theoreticist. I have no concepts, only percepts. And indeed, his training speaks to the practical. He actually first went to university for mechanical engineering at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba. And he did his first year in mechanical engineering, but then switched to literature. As he said, he read himself into English literature, although he did grow up in a very literary household. His mother was what you call an elocutionist back in that time, which was somebody who gave dramatic monologues, Shakespeare readings, poetry, that sort of thing. His father was a very gifted storyteller and musician. So Marshall switched to English literature, and actually he never looked back. He graduated from the University of Manitoba and won a scholarship to Cambridge. And in Cambridge, he would run into something called practical criticism. And this was the time when Cambridge English was being run by F.R. Leavis. And this idea of practical criticism was revolutionary at the time because it focused on the effect of poetry and literature, secondary or even disregarding who wrote it and what it means, or if it's a good or a bad poem. And this is very important because you can see how Marshall's training in practical criticism leads directly into his work. And it's a road that goes from the study of literature to the study of popular culture, specifically advertising and comics, which form the basis for his first book, The Mechanical Bride. And then he turned to the study of technology and culture, which is really interesting. And this work that I read that opening quote from, Exploration is One, is from 1953, edited by Edmund Carpenter. Marshall would edit later works, but Marshall and Carpenter worked together at the University of Toronto St. Michael's College. Marshall started there in 1946 and worked at St. Mike's for the rest of his career. I think he met Carpenter in 48 or something. Together, in the early 50s, they applied for and won a grant from the Ford Foundation to study culture and communication. And the main product of that was this series of magazines, Explorations. And I believe there were 9 published over the next few years, later brought into an anthology and actually recently reissued. So I think Width and Stock reissued them. They're kind of pricey, but they're very interesting. With the Ford Foundation grant, Carpenter and McLuhan assembled a group of people, several of them, interestingly enough, from Winnipeg. This first volume lists Easterbrook, McLuhan, Tyrwhitt, and Williams as associate editors, and includes contributions from David Reisman, Robert Graves, Hans Selye, Gregory Keeps, Northrop Frye, and McLuhan. Marshall's contribution is entitled Culture Within Literacy, and it's very worth reading. It's really interesting how much of Marshall's later work is apparent in this early work. To give you an example, so the thought is now beginning to occur: how many thousands of years of change can we afford every 10 years? may not a spot of culture lay here and there in the great time flux prove to be a kind of social and psychological oasis. That was in 1953. And that is basically what Marshall would later call media ecology. So Marshall's focus and my focus is on the practical versus theoretical, because despite some people calling Marshall a technological determinist, he was only really determined in understanding the nature of technology, and in particular, in order to give us some agency, because he didn't believe that we were helpless victims. As my dad said, we got ourselves into this mess and we can get ourselves out of it. Marshall's work is filled with examples of this. Particularly, he liked to bring up the Edgar Allan Poe story of the descent into the maelstrom, in which there's a sailor who gets sucked into this vortex in the sea, and this giant maelstrom, and he's going down, and it's taking forever. And he gets kind of bored and notices that certain objects are not going down, but are actually rising up. And by studying the nature of this maelstrom and the objects which are escaping it, he makes an escape himself. And Marshall loved to bring this up because he felt it was an apt metaphor for a technological situation, that we are in a maelstrom of our own making, and that it is only by studying the action and the workings of it that we can hope to escape, but we can escape. And that undercurrent of hope, lays waste to any claim of determinism that we're helpless. In fact, the opposite is true. So the practice of media ecology applied in McLuhan in 2020. The practice, it's about exercising and exploring and learning. Media ecology, it's interesting. Probably the best place to start is with that word media or medium. What does that mean? And in explaining what Marshall meant by the medium is the message, it's really helpful to look at what he meant by medium or media plural. In this book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, he goes into great detail in the first chapter, which is called The Medium is the Message, explaining what he means. And in fact, a first definition of medium or media is in the title of the book, Media, The Extensions of Man. So Marshall saw media as technologies as extensions of our being, of extensions of our senses, our faculties, our abilities, our bodies. And that is one definition of medium, a medium as a tool, as an object. The other definition is that he says every medium creates an environment of services and disservices, and he calls that environment a medium or media. Medium as environment. He wrote a piece called The Relation of Environment to Anti-Environment. And in fact, this book, Understanding Media, in 1964, kind of marks a shift in the way he talks about media and medium, and he turns more toward the environmental approach after 1964-65, and that's evident in his work. But it's kind of funny because it actually goes back earlier. He wrote a piece where he says after Sputnik, the world became global theater, and he delineates another term between Sputnik before and after 1957 from global theater, from global village to global theater. And he used the term global village to describe the environment that radio created. He used the term global theater to describe the environment that the satellite created, turning the Earth, the satellite created a proscenium arch, as he said. That's why he said on Spaceship Earth, there's no audience, only actors. There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. Buckminster Fuller also talked a lot about Spaceship Earth, and he and McLuhan were friends and colleagues. Art is anti-environment. I did a talk just a few months ago in March called Enter Through the Bookshop, McLuhan Monograffiti. And that's a nod toward Banksy's film Exit Through the Gift Shop. And Marshall used this term anti-environment to stand for anything that draws attention to the environment. Because he said media act as environments, but as invisible environments. He liked to quote John Culkin, who said, "We don't know who invented water or who discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish." These environments that technologies create through their effects go largely unnoticed because we concentrate on the content, on the use, on how we can use these tools, and at the expense of really paying attention to the effects of them. So tying into practicality, one way that Marshall used to discover these invisible environments was through the arts. And Ezra Pound said the artist is the antennae of the race. Marshall leaned heavily on the arts, and this comes from his training in practical criticism, because the artist is the person who's constantly attuning their perceptions in order to experience the world and explain it or expose us to it. That's often why a lot of new art looks very strange and unfamiliar and is even uncomfortable. And I'm glad I asked Julia about her last name, because van IJken, she says, means to recalibrate. And that is exactly what Marshall saw as the job of the artist. So I think you're perfectly situated, Julia. If I've got to grow into McLuhan, you have to grow into your artistic calibration. And I think you'll do fine. So Marshall leaned heavily on the arts throughout his career, and we can do that today. It's a whole other talk to go into Marshall McLuhan and the arts, and what in arts was to Marshall McLuhan, and how Marshall used the arts. But I've given you a few pointers there on what to look for. And it's not just visual arts, but also verbal arts. Marshall paid very close attention to language and the changing nature of language to show how things are changing in people's sensibility and perception. And that holds as true today as it did back then. A great place to see that is in popular culture, in music especially since our music these days is so heavily word-based. I'm thinking specifically of hip-hop and rap, where the music part of it fades more and more and more into the background, and the vocal and the word and the thought is more and more highlighted. The practice of media ecology. So ecology, according to the Ecological Society of America, according to Google, ecology is the study of the relationships between living organisms, including humans, and their physical environment. It seeks to understand the vital connections between plants and animals in the world around them. Media ecology is a little more difficult thing to pin down. What it is depends a little bit on who you ask. There are different schools, I think, of media ecology. There's definitely a McLuhan school, the Toronto school, a Winnipeg school of media ecology even. And there's a New York school, a US school. I'm not sure about the European scene. I don't know how interested they are in this concept of ecology in media. In my experience, and it's very, very limited, they're more interested in the theoretical. But I would love to know different. And if you know different, please let me know. If there's a Berlin School of Media Ecology or an Amsterdam School, I'd love to hear about it. So I can really best speak to the McLuhan idea of media ecology. And my father, Eric, says that he came up with the term while he and Marshall and Carpenter and Harley Parker and George Thompson were at Fordham University in the 1967-68 academic year. Marshall had been awarded the Schweitzer Chair of the Humanities at Fordham, and he used the rather considerable grant that came with it to bring Eric and Parker and Carpenter and other people down to Fordham to work with him. And a lot of things happened that year in New York. There's a lot of work to be done exploring McLuhan in New York, McLuhan's time in New York, and New York's effect on McLuhan, because actually New York kind of launched McLuhan in a way. McLuhan, Marshall, so it's weird for me to keep saying McLuhan, or Marshall, or Granddad or Dad. New York kind of launched McLuhan into the popular imagination. Marshall McLuhan became a household name, partly because of an article Tom Wolfe wrote, what if he's the most important thinker since Pavlov and Einstein? What if he's right? And this sort of kicked off a series of articles in a media barrage that lasted a couple of years, with Marshall appearing in magazines, interviews, Playboy magazine even, talk shows. So that kind of launched Marshall, and then Marshall spent this year in New York when they started this thing called media ecology. And Eric says in interviews that I came up with the term and posted and ran with it. When Marshall's year was over, Eric, my dad, was looking to stay in New York, and so he's looking for work, and he tried to see if Neil Postman would take him on. And that's when he says, he gave Postman this idea of media ecology, and Postman then famously created the media ecology department. Was it NYU, New York University, which runs to this day, I believe. Marshall's idea of media ecology goes back, as I said, at least to 1953, to that quote. He brings it up in Understanding Media, and that's why I brought this book. This is a beautiful copy. It's a bit of an artifact. It's inscribed to Corinne McLuhan, for an extension of me that can never be loved or thanked as she deserves from her proud husband, Marshall, which is lovely. What's a little less lovely is Marshall then took this book and, annotated the whole thing, which was his habit. But actually, this is a great book because I believe Marshall picked up this copy and started annotating it when he was approached to do a 10th anniversary revision of Understanding Media, which would eventually become Laws of Media, the New Science, which my dad worked with him on and published in 1988. I say that because when they started that project, they called it UMR, Understanding Media Revised, and there are notes throughout here referencing UMR, and it goes through chapter by chapter, making notes, definitely toward a new edition of Understanding Media. I brought this up though because this has a lovely marginal annotation here. Marshall wrote media ecology. And I've seen that one or two other places, but this was the one I could find and bring in today. And I'll read this, although it's slightly cringy. Marshall is not perfect. But I'll see why he made this annotation, media ecology, so that you get an idea of what he meant by the term. Margaret Mead is thinking here of change as uniform speed up of motion or uniform hotting up of temperatures in backward societies. We are currently coming within conceivable range of a world automatically controlled to the point where we could say 6 hours less radio in Indonesia next week, or there will be a great falling off in literary attention, or we can program 20 more hours of TV in South Africa next week to cool down the tribal temperature raised by radio last week. whole cultures could now be programmed to keep their emotional climate stable in the same way that we've begun to know something about maintaining equilibrium in the commercial economies of the world. You know, colonialist notions aside, which really shouldn't be pushed aside because Black Lives Matter and it's 2020. But that's a whole other talk. But this is evidence here of what Marshall meant by media ecology in 1964. And that was, he didn't mean simply theory or study, but action. You know, this idea that we created these messes and we can get ourselves out of them. Pardon me. Now, as I said, Eric McLuhan died in 2018, actually while we were together in Bogota, Colombia, and he delivered a speech called Media Ecology in the 21st Century. You can find it if you go to the McLuhan Institute on YouTube, where I've put up a recording of it. And thank you to the Universidad de la Sabana for making that available. I also say some words about it on medium.com. In this very important speech, which would end up being Eric McLuhan's last word on the subject, he talks in very great and specific detail about what media ecology is and what the prospects of it are going forward. And it's important to note that he was speaking in Latin America, in Colombia, and to them, while at the same time speaking for the people in the back, you know, New York and the other schools of media ecology. He definitely took the opportunity to give the McLuhan perspective on what media ecology was. As it happens, Lance Strait, a friend of ours, and former head of the Media Ecology Association, a professor at Fordham University, and sort of head of media ecology down there, was also there and delivered a speech. So it was an interesting meeting of two schools of media ecology. I'd encourage you to go watch that video, so I won't cover too much of it there and here. And quite unfortunately, the next day, as we were waiting to go home, my father died rather dramatically in our hotel room. So it was quite fitting that he gave this speech, Media Ecology in the 21st Century. And it's quite unfortunate that he left a lot of work unfinished, but somebody put up the link, thank you. You know, he did leave a lot behind. And just to speak on that for a second, Marshall and Eric aren't with us anymore, but they left so much behind to help us in practicing media ecology and in learning and applying their work. They left things like their published works in Explorations and elsewhere, and they each left an annotated library. My talk at NYU was based around my work studying and documenting and inventorying Marshall McLuhan's annotated library, which is, around 6,000 volumes. And it is heavily annotated. This is actually a very good example of that because it contains these marginal annotations, and it also contains these endnotes. And this is a very good example of an annotated work in Marshall or Eric's library, because of course Eric was Marshall's student and followed the methods that he learned from Marshall. Where this is very helpful is that Marshall was a workaholic. He couldn't help it. His brain was just always going. And it never stopped. He was also a voracious reader, and he read. While he was an original thinker, much of his work was based off other people's work by finding connections that nobody else saw. For example, taking practical criticism and applying it to the comics or to television for that matter. That's really where his genius lay. And while he read books, he was constantly making notes. which he later developed into essays, speeches, but he didn't merely do all of it. He left behind in this library, and my father did too, all of this work in embryo that is left there for us to discover and to develop. So one of the things that I'm trying to do, one of the reasons I created this McLuhan Institute was to help make that possible. If you're interested, Marshall McLuhan's library is now housed at the Fisher Rare Book Library at the University of Toronto. Some of it can be seen online. All of it can be seen in person. If you go there, you can check their catalog and request an item, and they'll bring it up for you, and you can read it to your heart's content, which is great. I'm really glad, if it has to be anywhere but here, that it's there and that it is accessible. And the great thing about it is you don't have to be an academic. Anybody can come in off the street and have a look at his work. And I think that's very important, for one, because I'm not an academic, although I'd probably get in because of my name. That does open some doors. But anybody can really go see. And that's very important to me because, you know, the rest of the world is outside of academia. And it's the rest of the world that needs to wrestle with technological change because, you know, we're affected by it, whether we like it or not. I really love that Julia gave this title, The Practice of Media Ecology Applied McLuhan in 2020. And just before we started here, she told me that, oh, thanks again. Just before we started, Julia told me that she got that title from a tweet that I sent. So really, I have myself to thank for it. I use Twitter as a kind of my own one-way song, a bit of a sounding board, place to park thoughts that I have. And I'm kind of using it to write a book, but that's another subject. Anyway, Applied McLuhan refers to something Marshall said, which was that he called his word applied choice. He also called his work a footnote to Harold Innis, and he said that in his introduction to the second edition of Harold Innis's Bias in Communication. Innis also famously worked at the University of Toronto, and Marshall met him because he found out that Innis was using his book Mechanical Bride in one of his classes. Marshall hadn't heard of Harold Innis up until then. Harold Innis was ostensibly a political economist. You could also say a media ecologist. And Marshall learned a lot from him. But he learned a lot from Joyce. Specifically, this book, Finnegan's Wake. And it's a point of frustration for a lot of people. Inconvenient, maybe, that Marshall brings up Joyce so much. Throughout all of Marshall McLuhan's work, as many authors as he built off and used, he used no one as much as he used Joyce. Maybe Shakespeare after that, maybe the Bible after that. But Joyce, hands down, and Finnegan's Wake, of all of them. And he said that, Marshall said that his work was applied Joyce. And that's why I threw this tweet, Applied McLuhan, in to bring up this notion of practicality. So I'm going to read a few things out of this book, Theories of Communication. This was published by Eric McLuhan with contributions from Marshall in 2011 by Peter Lang, New York. It's an expensive book, but I highly recommend it. In the introduction, Eric says, a fundamental principle of this book is that communication entails change. And he defines theory of communication, someone's theory of communication, as their intended audience and their intended effect. So intended audience plus intended effect equals theory of communication. And this was an idea that Marshall and Eric came up with back in the day. And they set out to discover and tell us what various people's theories of communication are. So this book is a collection of them. Wyndham Lewis, his theory of art and communication, formal causality in Chesterton, Francis Bacon's theory of communication, Thomas Aquinas' theory of communication. Eric wrote a piece in here called The Yay, Marshall McLuhan's theory of communication. And it's slightly tongue-in-cheek because, Marshall famously said that he wasn't a theorist. He wasn't a theorist. He didn't have theories, and he protested that quite a bit. So to talk about his theory of communication is a little bit of a joke, but also coming back to this idea that somebody's theory of communication is their intended audience plus their intended effect, and that communication for them, for McLuhan's, entails change. And it's a metaphysical matter. Marshall also liked to say that mind is a transformation theory of communication, not a transportation theory of communication, which is how he characterized the Shane and Weaver model of communication. So I'll read a few things here, if you'll forgive me, regarding applied Joyce. Marshall McLuhan was not at all reticent about the debt he owed to James Joyce, and frequently uttered and published such statements as this: "Nobody could pretend serious interest in my work who is not completely familiar with all of the works of James Joyce and the French symbolists." He intended such statements to be taken quite literally, and truly, a full appreciation of McLuhan's work is impossible without the sort of perceptual training that such familiarity instills. Practicality. Needless to say, that is not an attractive proposition, particularly to those from fields other than literature who resent any imputation that the training afforded by their own studies is in any measure inadequate. Consequently, such statements have come to be regarded as nothing more than provocative hyperbole. McLuhan, however, like Joyce, demanded the highest scholarship and erudition of those who would take him seriously or who would attempt to share his vision. He remarked once to me, as I know he did to many others, that his work on media and culture was, in the main, applied Joyce. In that case, it might be fair to say that no one can claim a serious appreciation of Joyce's work without a complete familiarity with the full spectrum of McLuhan's work. Joyce himself claimed to be, quote, the greatest engineer who ever lived. Eric brings up a lot of things there. Oh my goodness, I'm low on battery. Julia, forgive me, I have to plug in my computer. This is terrible.
Don't worry, Alice. All fine.
This is where I need the theme music, Julia.
Yeah. I still don't have it backed up here. I just want to quickly check, because I got a text from one person actually saying that they could hear a bit of an echo. Is anyone else experiencing that? Because I can't hear an echo, so I hope that's not a general issue. If anyone else has that issue, send a little message on the chat, and then we know. Okay, someone else says yes. Okay, someone else says yes for the echo. And someone else says no, yeah. So I know a few people haven't experienced an echo. Okay, so if there's not a general echo, I think we can just keep going as is.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry about that. The pitfalls of doing Zoom speeches, right? It's a different, brave new world. So a lot of things are brought up here, but Eric explains what he means by applied Joyce. Full appreciation of McLuhan's work is impossible without the sort of perceptual training that such familiarity instills. And this comes back to Marshall's statement, the medium is the message, that it's the effect that technologies have over the actual content. And this touches on how Marshall used the arts for the training of perception and sensibility more than oftentimes what actually is the content of any given piece of art. excuse me, a couple other things. Marshall McLuhan, Eric says in Theories of Communication, was a modern grammarian. That is, he was concerned with reading and interpreting not only literary texts, but also what traditional grammarists called the book of nature, the world around him. This is why I brought up Banksy and street art in relation to McLuhan, because Marshall didn't live to see the birth of graffiti in street art, but he would have absolutely loved it as much as he would have loved stand-up comedy today, as for its anti-environmental nature. Because what somebody like Banksy does is they draw attention to the invisible environment. This is made really obvious in one work of his that I really love, based on Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. And I think this piece is in Bristol, and it shows a wall with a fire alarm on it, a red fire alarm. And Banksy has used that fire alarm as pearl earring and illustrated Vermeer's Girl around it. So what Banksy does is he's bringing out things inherent or invisible normally in the environment to our attention. And I think we can easily see the metaphor to media study. Pardon me. He consequently maintained a keen interest in writers and poets of all periods and their methods of observation of men and affairs, as his writings demonstrate. In this regard, although he did his doctoral work on Nash and the Elizabethans, he wrote it, as he remarks from the outset, from the point of view of grammar. And that refers to what was published, I think, in 2004, Marshall's doctoral thesis, the classical trivium, the place of Thomas Nash in the work at this time. He frequently consulted Finnegan's Wake in particular, and Joyce in general, not just for ideas, but also for sharpening and training. Such is one of the great traditional uses for the arts. He was the first, and for many years the only one, to offer courses in the moderns, Joyce, Eliot, Pound, Lewis, Yeats, at the University of Toronto, having recently completed his studies at Cambridge, where Eliot, Richards, and Emerson were all the rage. The classical trivium is an insane work of scholarship, which I have read and I would recommend picking up, but it is extremely dense. It's half footnotes, and it's an incredible work of scholarship. Again, I'll refer back to my opening quote that the speaker has too much to say for the time allowed, and I don't want to make this an eternity for you. To move on. A final note. Marshall McLuhan regarded Joyce as a colleague and used him that way. Whenever he made a discovery about technology and culture, he would open the Wake and read for a bit, and there, sure enough, he would find that Joyce had already been over the ground years earlier. Joyce followed the lines of force in the language and read and recorded what was registered there about the convolutions and disturbances of human experience and perception. Often, too, Marshall would find a pregnant allusion or turn of phrase in the Wake that would set off a chain reaction of association about some matter under discussion. He did not simply use Joyce to confirm an insight. He did that to whatever extent the text allows. Some critics have charged that McLuhan used Joyce's page as an ink blot into which to project his own fantasies. He also used Joyce to stimulate fresh awareness of the present moment. In the same spirit, Joyce recommended using Vico, quote, for all he was worth. Even today, Joyce gladly performs the same service for anyone willing to rise, or as some insist, sink, to his level of play. It is a commonplace that all great art has the same invigorative and illuminative power, in particular that power defines and characterizes low and motley Minipian satire. And just as As I said there, I recommend treating Marshall McLuhan the same way, as a colleague, a co-author, teacher, and using him, as Joyce recommended, using Eco for all this work. This to me summarizes applying McLuhan and this notion of practicality over theory. Marshall went the same way. He used what he found useful and disregarded what he didn't. And he never pretended to have the final word in everything. He famously said, "I don't explain, I explore." He said, "I don't necessarily agree with everything I say." He said, "I see no point in making anything but controversial statements." He talked a lot about the idea of probes, of probing, of exploring. He considered himself an explorer, as this journal, Explorations, suggests. I think today we have to move in 2020 and beyond, beyond this notion of exploration, although there's certainly new things to explore every day. But I think in highlighting the practical and applying McLuhan and others, we need to think of ourselves and act more like navigators. That is, we need to use the work of these early explorers for all their worth, to train ourselves, our sensibility, and our powers of exploration and probing. Use them in order to move beyond theory and into practice, into this idea of media ecology as something more than a field of study, but a field of action. A few years ago, I wrote a piece because I was interested in the relation of Rachel Carson to Marshall McLuhan. And there's a funny coincidence where Rachel Carson wrote in 1962 The Silent Spring, and Marshall McLuhan wrote in 1962 The Gutenberg Galaxy. And as Marshall said later, actually in 1975, that with Sputnik in 1957, the ecological approach was inevitable, that we would eventually, by being able to see the Earth from a distance for the first time, that objective look, we would see that nature ended, and we would see the Earth as a work of art, and that ecological thinking became an inevitability. Marshall's approach as an environmental approach is necessarily an ecological approach. When you're looking at the effect of something, you have to look beyond the page and into the world. You have to look beyond the screen and into the world. You have to look at education. You have to look at resources. You have to look at the fact that everybody is a nervous wreck, that people are constantly in search of their various identities: sexual, gender, personal, family, religious, spiritual. All identities are suddenly at the window, and nobody knows what to think. You have to look everywhere, essentially, because an environment is total. And one of the tenets of one of the laws of media is that every new environment encompasses the old environment totally. The interesting thing about Carson and McLuhan is Carson wrote The Silent Spring, which kind of blew the lid off environmental pollution and led to an environmental movement in organizations like Greenpeace, activist wings. People could see, seemingly for the first time, the effect that humans have on the physical environment. Ecology was born. And they decided that, we need to do something about this, and we can do something about this. Factories don't need to pour chemicals into rivers and kill all the fish. We don't need DDT as much as we need birds to be able to lay eggs whose shells can hold a baby bird. So the notion of physical, natural ecology contains a notion of tending to the environment and action. And media ecology, I think, needs to be the same thing. As Marshall suggests early in his work and through his career, as Eric suggested, media ecology in the 21st century, we're beyond a place where we need to be bystanders and scientists studying things. We need to take action if we want to have any charge in our destiny. As Marshall said, I'm unwilling to let the juggernaut simply roll over me. You're just looking for the places to turn off buttons. And so that is the notion of media ecology. It's a personal notion in that, to an extent, you can choose the type of media you're subjected to. For myself, I have a lot of screen time, but I read a lot of books, and I can't pretend that you're going to be able to mitigate the effects totally, but it helps, I think. So that I recommend people read as much physical books as you can, because reading on the screen is not much better than doing what we're doing. It's all a screen, all the world's a screen. So I think I'll end there as this notion of applied McLuhan being McLuhan in action, and recommend people pick up books like Theories of Communication, because in Dad's piece, Marshall McLuhan's Theory of Communication, he really lays out a lot of places to go to look for ways to help you understand the nature of media and technology, and do something about it in our lives and in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really interesting. I'll ask you a couple of questions, and then we can open up to the audience as well. Actually, one of the first questions I was going to ask, which you just alluded to a little bit as well, but I wonder if you can maybe say a little bit more about that, because obviously you've dealt with all this work in such an in-depth way. You've been studying it for quite some time, and I wonder in what sense it's made you interact with media and technology differently in your own personal life, actually. If you could say something like that.
It has, for sure. I mean, there's a reason they say ignorance is bliss. Because once you know something, you can't forget that you know it. Once you understand, understanding media, the extensions of man, is the McLuhan book that I'm most familiar with. Marshall wrote a lot. I don't know if it's possible in any person's lifetime to really study and absorb it all. I mean, you can read it all in a year if you really put your mind to it, but understanding it is another matter, and it takes years and years and years. I read Understanding Media several times before I understood Understanding Media, because, I mean, it's kind of meta, the medium is the message. It's about creating a mental state which is able to understand these things. And as Eric said, here in Theories of Communication, that Marshall demanded the utmost scholarship and erudition. He makes you work to understand. It's you can't just read a book and know what he's about. Really understanding what the medium is, the message means, or any of the other parts of understanding media takes concentration and it takes work. The first paragraph, the first page of the first chapter, the medium is the message, takes a lot of work. It's really, really dense. Marshall, you have to remember that Marshall was an English teacher for his entire career, and it's not a coincidence. I tried to illustrate that in my talks, that you can't have Marshall McLuhan, the technology expert, without Marshall McLuhan, the literature expert. The one thing is directly related to the other. Similarly, if we want to follow their footsteps, we have, to a certain extent, to follow their methods. And I mean, that's a little uncomfortable for some people, as again, Eric said there. People don't like being told that what they've learned in their own disciplines might not be enough. And I find it really interesting that people don't seem to pay attention to that in media studies. For example, when Marshall was learning this stuff, there were no media studies. There weren't really communication departments. All this came out of English literature and literature studies. And what media department, what communication department these days includes any kind of study of English literature? I'm curious, I'd love to know. But I don't think it's very serious. I've thought for a long time about, when I first thought of doing the McLuhan Institute, I thought of starting a McLuhan school. And my idea for that was that Marshall was a genius, okay, but he wasn't a genie. He wasn't a magician. He didn't pull these things out of thin air. He developed the tools to be able to study technology. And I thought, well, if he did it, then we can do it. And indeed, he left behind a lot of things like the tetrad, his concept, his appropriation of the concept of figure and ground, things like this, practical criticism, these tools that he used to look at and understand technology and culture. And so I had the great idea of creating a course of study which would teach people how to think like a McLuhan. A bit of Grenadier's notion. The thing that encourages me is that I'm not university trained. Anything that I've learned in McLuhan has been hard won. It has, nothing has come easily for me. And I figured that if I can learn it, then anybody else can. And I think it's kind of an asset that I didn't go through the academic training, because hopefully I speak a little more plainly and comprehensively to you people. I'll let you be the judge of that.
And actually, on that note, you're currently doing a pop-up satellite in Wellington, Ontario, I think. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that's about?
I'd love to. So 3 years ago, I started this McLuhan Institute because I saw a time when Eric McLuhan wouldn't be around any longer. I didn't know it would be less than a year later. And there was nothing in place to continue as Eric did. Marshall died New Year's Eve 1980, and my dad kept going for decades and decades, finishing Laws of Media, publishing it in 1988. Several other important books like Theories of Communication, Media Informal Cause, a lot of other things, The Sensus Communis, Synesthesia and Soul, several other books, important speeches, essays. So I looked around and realized that nobody was going to do it if I didn't. And certainly nobody was going to do it the way that I felt needed to be done, and that is continuing in this McLuhan tradition, which I've outlined in this talk, which incorporates a lot of literature and studies in popular culture, leaning heavily on the arts, perceptual training, training senses and sensibility. One of the fun courses that I'm looking forward to offer is a Finnegan's Wake reading group. And when I thought about doing this course of McLuhan study, there would be a course mandatory that everybody had to take. And all we did in the class was sit in the circle and read and talk about Finnegan's Wake. There were no real tests or anything. But it's by soaking in this brine, acclimatizing ourselves and making ourselves this, ecology, training our sensibility and perception, that we begin to be able to create in ourselves somebody who is able to explore these areas. They give us eyes to see. So I didn't really expect to have a place to run the McLuhan Institute for years and years and years. And I had the idea to start it as a pop-up shop, a pop-up institute, where I would take all these different things I wanted to do at the McLuhan Institute, namely teaching, education, exploration, investigation with and through the arts, and opened them up as temporary spaces in places like Toronto, New York, London. If anybody wants to bring me there, I'd love to do it. A pop-up shop, a micro institute, a satellite, and I love the idea of the satellite. So my little logo here, which I was very fortunate to have my friend Dwayne King in Portland design for me, shows Sputnik satellite in 1957 with this pigeon hanging from it. And you'll see in the background here, this is my logo for the McLuhan Institute. When you turn it right side up, you have a pigeon sitting on top of a W. And the W today stands for Wellington, but originally it stood for Winnipeg. And Marshall liked to call himself, being from Winnipeg, a Winnipigeon. That's not a thing. Other people don't call themselves Winnipigeons, really. But I love this idea of a pigeon on top of the W for Winnipeg. So for the McLuhan Institute, I figuratively flip the bird, and it's a pigeon hanging from an M for McLuhan, or media, or Marshall, or what have you. The idea is in play. And that's in my name, the McLuhan Institute as well, which, if you notice, the acronym is TMI. And when I came up with it, my uncle said, you know what TMI means, right? I said, yeah, I know what TMI means. But that's the point here, too much information, and we've got to make sense of it. And that's what Applied McLuhan is about, making sense of information. So I've got this pop-up McLuhan Institute going right now. If you visit the McLuhaninstitute.com, there's a bit more information about it. I don't imagine anybody watching is in the Wellington, Ontario area, but I'd like to offer virtual visits. So using my handy smartphone here, I'll give you a tour of everything around here. Every day I bring in a different object. Right now I've got one of Marshall McLuhan's ties. That's Marshall's portrait by Wyndham Lewis. Different things to explain and explore the history, talk about where to go. And I'll teach little classes for $20. I'll explain the meanings and message to you, things like that. It's by donation and by appointment. So on the website, it lists the email address, satellite@themcluhaninstitute.com, and make an appointment, and we'll meet here at the satellite.
Good stuff. So I can see there's a couple of questions in the audience as well, from Sheena and Luke. Does one of you just want to unmute themselves and ask the question? Maybe that's nicer. Feel free to unmute.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I haven't got a camera at the moment. Thank you so much for that talk. It was absolutely fantastic. I really appreciated it. I'm a teacher, and I do some teaching at the RCA as well. And I'm really struck by what you were saying in terms of this problem that we have all the time in education about what they call closing this theory-practice gap. And I'm wondering how McLuhan might help us think about how we might do this. And after I read that, you then said something about figure ground. And I was thinking about how maybe this relationship between the figure and the ground that are required to kind of create each other, like you don't have the figure without the ground or the ground without the figure, might be a more useful way to think about theory and practice than the way it's normally posed, which is these two things are separated and somehow we have to bring them together as if we're kind of like attracting them through some magnetic force. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, because I'm really inspired by some of the things you've talked about today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, look, theory is useful. It's always useful to ask questions. But theory is a tool. Theory is a tool that gives us answers that we can put into practice. And that's how we close this loop, by putting it into practice. And I like to focus on the practical applications of McLuhan work. So, for example, figure and ground. I don't have a copy of it here right now. Marshall, with Catherine Hutchin and Eric McLuhan, wrote a book in '77 called City as Classroom, Understanding Language and Media. You can get a copy at the McLuhaninstitute.com. There's a little shop button, and if you click that, you can see our shop including copies.
I've already checked out your shop. I'll go back and look for that. Yeah.
It's a useful, if very outdated book. It was written in the 70s. The idea is that there's more information available to the student now outside the classroom than in it. So the best thing to do is take the student outside of the classroom and into the actual environment where the information lies. I did a little talk a couple weeks ago based on Cities Classroom called the Smart Cities Classroom, because I think the prospects for using a city as a classroom are greater than they've ever been, especially with tools like augmented reality, where we can really fill the environment with information for people to seek out. Because half the fun is in finding, exploring, show and tell. One of the main tools or principles that Cities Classroom rests on is this idea of figure and ground. And I deliver a workshop on it, on figure and ground. I've taught it to as young as grade 5, 6 students, and I teach it to university students. And it goes like this. Marshall borrowed these terms from a Danish psychologist, Edgar Rubin, from the Gestalt School of Psychology, figure and ground. And Rubin used these terms to describe the structure of visible phenomena, where, for example, in painting, you have a figure, which is the object of attention, and you have a ground, which is the background. Marshall took these terms from painting, like he took practical criticism, and he applied them to the study of technology, where you have an object like the smartphone as a figure, and you have a ground, which is everything required for this object to work, to be, and every effect it has. So the way I run it like this, and I use smartphones a lot because everybody has one and it's really simple. And I basically crowdsource from the class the answers. So I get in front of the whiteboard and I explain these terms figure and ground. And we choose smartphone, I write phone. And then I ask the class, I say, so in order for this object to work, what do you need? So I'll call on everybody in turn, or people can share it, and they'll say electricity, so I'll write electricity. And they'll say cell phone towers, so I'll write cell phone towers. And they'll say networks and technology and education and raw materials and batteries. And very quickly the board fills up, and you need money, and you need people designing them, and you need people building them, and you need people designing software, and the board fills up. And part of my job is to put things on the board in such a way that you can see the relationships between them and the interconnectivity. So we're assembling this environment, and you can see how an environment is made of constituent parts, but they all work together and they all rely on each other. And this is a lot of fun, and especially with the younger kids, they have a lot of fun thinking of things and yelling things out. And the great thing is, when I'm sure as a teacher, there's nothing better than a responsive class, and when the class is really eager and responding and working with you, because you don't really teach anything. You ideally help students to learn, and the best learning happens when you don't know you're learning, when you're just having fun. Marshall liked to say that anybody who thinks there's a difference between education and entertainment doesn't know the first thing about either, right? They're inseparable. So we get this board really full, and then this is the fun part, especially with the younger kids. And I said, okay, now imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and your smartphone doesn't work, and it's never going to work again. Something has happened and we don't have smartphones anymore. And the reaction is an audible gasp because they can't imagine an 8-year-old kid, a 10-year-old kid who doesn't know anything different than life with smartphones can't imagine life without it. Of course, you and I know that we did everything just a bit we do now before then. But this thing, these technologies quickly become such a part of our life that they're inextricable. They remake everything. And not only do they shape our environment through our physical environment and all this, but they also have very serious psychological effects and social effects. We have a whole discipline of neuroscience. Neuroplasticity describes how the brain constantly changes depending on the input from our senses. And our technologies are direct causes for those things, for that kind of shaping. The children interact with each other primarily through these devices. Even on the schoolyard, when they're in front of each other, they're interacting through their smartphones. In the last several months, we've come to rely on things like this and this more than ever. And I think you'll notice that things have changed a little bit. A lot of things have amped up. And, correlation is causation, but it's not causation either. There are direct causes. So by taking the ground away, by removing the figure, it exposes the ground and lets you see the other effects a little more easily. These invisible effects or invisible environment, which are the personal, the psychic, and social consequences, as Marshall called them. The effects on our senses and our sensory lives, the social effects. All of these things make up the ground of any given technology, the environment of effects, of services and disservices. So figuring ground is very seemingly simple, but very effective and complex tool for understanding the nature of technologies. It's like the medium is the message. It describes the medium as the message. So after we're done this exercise, and I've talked about these things as well, I say, now you know why the medium is the message, because another word for ground is medium. And now you know why John Culkin said of Marshall McLuhan's work, we shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us.
Yeah.
And 10-year-old kids get it, which is remarkable. 20, 30 years ago, university kids, older people didn't get it. But it's very encouraging to me that I think we're in a place now where these things aren't just comprehensible, but they're obvious. And that to me is very encouraging. So highly recommend Cydia's classroom, although I've given you basically, the best part of it, this figure and ground book. But I still recommend picking up, sending an email, and be happy to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's such a great answer. I really appreciate it. I think that actually leads really nicely to Luke's question. I think Luke has a question about the kind of relationship between this new technological form of, that we've been kind of forced into because of the moment that we're in. And Luke, what were you thinking in your question?
Yeah,
thank you, Andrew.
It does lead on. Thanks, Sheena, and thanks very much. It was a really interesting talk. Concepts such as the age of anxiety and a lot of the concepts that Marshall kind of lays out seem to be kind of more pointed than ever, more relevant through the sort of recent events. And even this kind of lecture format itself is a kind of improvised response to a sudden sort of shock in the media. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts regarding sort of this kind of pause, but also this acceleration of kind of intensification of media that we're experiencing.
Well, thank you. And actually, it's funny because at the top of my screen, I've got Julia and I've got you, Luke, and that's it. So you've been my audience. Thank you. It's at once a bit of a blessing and a bit of a curse. There's a great, just like they say, there's a quote in the Bible for everything. There's really a McLuhan quote for every occasion. Here, Marshall liked to bring up somebody who said, if they only raised the bathwater half a degree every hour, we wouldn't know when to scream. Right? So it's a consequence of the rapid pace of technology that at speed we're able to see patterns. Information overload yields to pattern recognition. because things happen so fast, we don't have time to adjust to the backwater. And it's as if we're lobsters being put into a pot of boiling water. I can sympathize with the lobster at this point, because I think we all feel like him. We're, being we've been plunged into boiling water, and it's burning our skin, our nerves, which, the internet, electricity, Marshall said, extended the central nervous system and put our nervous system inside our bodies. And it sure feels like that, doesn't it? We're all so raw right now. And we're seeing the fallout from it. So, paradoxically, it's at once a blessing and a curse that the change happens so fast and is impossible to adjust to, which is why we're able to now notice it. The environment, water becomes visible when somebody kicks up the mud, and we're in a position of having a lot of mud in the water. But it's one thing to say, hey, the water's muddy. It's another thing to say, hey, maybe we should get some filters going, and purify that water a bit. And it's Marshall liked to avoid what he called value judgments. It was really hard to pin down on whether something was good or bad. And this comes back again to practical criticism, which pushed aside value judgment and looked at the effect, because it's when we decide that something is good or bad that we give up probing it as much, because we've decided what it is. It's very interesting. I like to think as Luddites, as media ecologists, right? Because they're people who are unwilling to simply accept technology and do something about it. I remember hearing a story about a Mennonite sect in the U.S. who they weren't hands down against technology for the sake of being against technology. They were interested in what could be useful to them, but they were conscious of a level of harm. So when smartphones came out, 10 plus years ago, and became a thing, they looked into adopting them into their society. So what they did was they took a group of people, a small group of people, and they gave them, iPhones and let them use them for a couple of months or something, and observed what happened. And they decided that the utility was far outweighed by the negativity, the negative consequences. And so they decided, no, we don't need this. Sure, it's going to help us do this and that, but it's also going to irrevocably change and ruin our way of life. I'm also reminded of the story of an Indian village, which some well-meaning person visited and saw these women all day, basically spent all their time going to the well, filling up a pot of water, balancing it on their head, carrying it home, going back to the well, filling up a pot of water, balancing again and again and again. And I thought, well, we can save them all this time by a bit of plumbing, a pump and some pipes, and we're in business. So we did it. And then not too long later, the village gathered and discussed it and asked them to remove it all, because they stopped talking to each other, and they stopped sharing their stories, and they stopped laughing and meeting, because the well was where they all got together and were able to see each other and spend some time with each other, and it had changed their community, and they felt not for the better. This is, to me, media ecology. It's being conscious, active participants in our own lives, understanding that there are trade-offs with anything that we do, any technology that we use, and deciding if it's worth it on a personal level, on a societal level. I mean, it's well past time we had an equivalent of the FDA for technology. How is it that a pharmaceutical company wants to put a drug into society, And it has to go through years of trials and testing to make sure that it is safe and effective. Those are their criteria. The difficulty with technology is what it does safe and effective mean, because our criteria for evaluating technology is mainly, does this let me get on Facebook and how fast? You know, an idea of harm is, if I hold this to my head, is it going to fry my brain? You know, and these are very, very superficial things because, yes, if you hold it to your head for a long time, it's going to fry your brain. But regardless of that, it's remade our society completely, totally. And just one last quote, there's this great interaction between Marshall McLuhan and W.H. Auden, the playwright, and they're having a debate. This is on YouTube, you can see it, the Auden and McLuhan debate. They're having a debate about television. And Auden says, television, I wouldn't dream of having television. Marshall says, well, you suffer the consequences without enjoying any of the benefits. Because you know what? Today I can say, you know what? No more smartphone. I'm not going to have it in my life. Great. Does that mean I'm not going to live in a society ruled by the smartphone? No. You know, will it make a difference? Yeah, it'll make some difference, but it's very superficial. So in order for media ecology to be serious, it's the same way with environmentalism. You know, it's great that I recycle. It's great that I compost. But if the factory is going to continue to pump its effluent into the ocean, into the air, we're screwed, you know. So yes, my contribution helps, and I can take steps to lead the healthiest life that I can, but an environment doesn't change because of one person's effort. It's a collective effort, and especially it's top down. So it was a public outcry in the early 20th century that led to the development of the Food and Drug Administration, because people were sick of being sick by tainted meat in cans. People were sick of being sold snake oil and drugs that were dubious efficacy. Public outcry leads to political will, you know, because look, no technology company is going to voluntarily submit to the kind of trials that Pfizer submits to before it releases a drug. Not going to happen. And they'll protest that if you impose regulations, you're going to kill the economy, you're going to kill the free market, you're going to kill innovation. But look, did the FDA kill the pharmaceutical industry? Is any pharmaceutical company hurting for profits? Yeah, I don't think so. You know, constraints aren't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in art, constraints are what gives you creativity. There's nothing worse than a blank canvas, you know, or no canvas at all. You know, start with a canvas, start with a page. You have somewhere to go, but you know, I can't believe I'm saying this, but too much freedom isn't necessarily a good thing, right? So to me, we're in the very, very early days of what media ecology needs to be. And hopefully more and more people get upset by the effects of technologies in their lives and make enough of a noise about it that we can create the political will to start to do something about it. Because you know, we need a Greta Thunberg for media ecology. Unfortunately, we're not going to get anywhere until we do. But finally, that's the one good thing maybe about our current situation in this COVID time is that we're all being plunged into the boiling pot of water. And maybe we can start to say, hey, this isn't so good. Let's do something about this.
Thank you very much. I think there's another question coming from Kanyang.
Would you like to unmute Kanyang and ask the question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just, I'm really interested in the talks you gave before about the media Ecology and the global village, because I think when we think about the interconnection between human being and media, we think about maybe like the network and also the biodiversity of the mediums. But I just, because realized the most recent theories I've been read about always talk about like the passive negative aspect of the technology, and always being talking about the power behind all these mediums and the social institutions and operators for making these technical images. So I'm wondering, through the process of producing all the images and circulate these things among the media, do we still have that aspect of increasing the biodiversity of the message itself, or we being like going through all this process and being like a more like a singular or linear way of approaching the message itself?
I'm not entirely clear what you're asking, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry. I guess my question is, like, I think, sorry, like when we talk about the multimedia and the hybridity of the medium, think about like multiple approach of translating message among the medium. And I think the mass media and the mass production, the process of what we went through is like the process of circulating different message among our network, especially when we got everything online and all the knowledge we have, all the accessibility to these knowledges that many people believe like we have now free access to all these knowledge and messages. But sometimes people are thinking maybe this message are already being moduled and being filtered down through all these social operators, and it's being gone through the process. And what we see through this medium and the message we've been read about is already like being flattened. So in that sense, it's like we lost that biodiversity through the media.
I mean, every new medium, every new technology in its effects brings about a new culture. It remakes us, and it forces us, by giving us a new language, it forces us to re-express everything in a new way. And so you get, a radio drama, which is based on a book, which turns into a film, which then turns into a TV show, which now is a Netflix series, which, and on and on and on and on. We're always seeking new ways of expressing things when we have a new way to say it, and we have a new audience because we're very different people. I'm actually encouraged by the diversity of forms because it gives us, I think, more opportunities for understanding, and that's why it's really good to look all different places for your areas, for your information, across the arts, in sciences, across languages. Marshall McLuhan had a habit of every morning of reading the Bible. And this wasn't just because he was Catholic and believed in God and everything, but whenever he traveled, he would ask for permission, but he would take a Bible that was in his hotel room, because there's usually one in the drawer from the Gideon's Bible. And he did this because the Bible is one of the most reliable texts for translation across languages. It's a really good control. And Marshall believed that every language was a different way of seeing the world and situations. And this was one way that he shaped his own perceptions and sensibilities through languages. So every morning he would read the Bible in several languages in order to widen his field of view. You can do this through languages. You can do this through styles, through music, through arts. But as I said, understanding isn't a point of view. It's a field approach, and everything is everything. But it comes back to this ground, this environmental view, and the more tools and faculties you're able to bring to bear, the more your chance of apprehending the total situation.
I guess like taking the Bible as example is from like the text, so it's from one author to the audience, so it's maybe like more about a linear approach, and when we have like network, it's more about one-to-many, like a dialogue space, or maybe we name it as like amphitheater space for more about communication and double-sided communication. But like the earlier medium is more about getting through one side to the other. So my question might be like, is that like one-to-many model you think that will increase the social biodiversity, or it's more about like the force and the power behind controlling everything, filtering down everything?
I mean, they're very different things. Marshall talked a lot about the differences between visual and acoustic space. That is, sense of space as experienced by the eye, which is linear and sequential and one thing after another. And the sense of space as experienced by the ear, the acoustic space in which everything happens at once, simultaneously. And this was one of his major ways of seeing the changes in the major changes, the sort of meta changes of technology over time, is that we went from an oral society to a print-based, to manuscript to print, and then with the electricity back away from that to more like an oral society. That article, A Culture Without Literacy in Explorations 1, goes into that a lot. And the Gutenberg Galaxy, his 1962 book, is a book about print culture and the changes, the effects of print culture on society, how the idea of movable type and repetition and consistency led to things like the assembly line of Henry Ford, and how these forms give rise to certain cultures. Electricity marked the end of that, and not so much a return to the way things were, but a new era more like the way things were than the era of literacy, which he felt turned into be a short episode in history, unfortunately for him, because he really was a literate person, being a lover of literature and poetry, and would have rather stayed in that society. But we can't live in history. We've got to live today. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was such an amazing talk, really insightful, and all your answers were great too. That was really great. Thank you very much. We've run over time a little bit, so I have a few more questions to ask, but I think we should cap it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for everybody watching. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these subjects with you.